Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hi everyone, welcome to Modern Money Doughnuts, our show about ecological economics and modern monetary theory. My name's Gabrielle Bond. I'm a director and CEO of Modern Money Lab, and I'm also an organiser at the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group in Adelaide, South Australia. I'd just like to mention before I hand over to Stephen that the music at the beginning of our show is by my partner, played by my partner, Alexander Hannes, and you can check out more of his work. He's a pianist and now morphing into digital artist as well. You can check out more of his work at www.hanys.net. I'm here with Stephen and our good friend Sherry. Stephen, would you like to say what you're up to?
Well, my name's Stephen Hale. I am an economist at Gabby's organisation that she's the CEO of, Modern Money Lab, and academic director on the graduate programs in the economics of sustainability at Torrens University here in Adelaide, in South Australia, where in the Adelaide Hills, it's actually a bit chilly today, which is why I've got my jumper on. We're moving into what we call autumn, some people call fall. We've got a guest with us today who was with us on our first series, haven't we, Gabby?
Yeah. So welcome, Sherry. Dr. Sherry Wise is a senior economist at the US Department of Agriculture, and she's a regular on Kerberos Media Productions. And I see while we talk about regulars, we've got a lot of our regular listeners tuning in. So hello, everybody who's listening, and hello, everybody who's watching us later on replay as well. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for joining us, Sherry. How are you?
Well, good. Thank you, Steve and Gabby. I am doing pretty well. The weather here in the Washington, D.C. area is very mixed. We had like 70s one day and 30s the next. So it's been kind of crazy. So anyway, but these things happen nowadays, I'm afraid. So.
Yeah.
They do indeed. We've got a large part of the southeastern Australian coast is underwater at the moment. We have once in 500-year floods, they call them, but actually they're about once in every 10-year floods these days, including much of Sydney. Much of Sydney is underwater at the moment. People in the US, if they've heard of one Australian city, that's the one that they've probably heard of. And actually, we are going to talk about climate change, and particularly climate change in farming today. And the Australian Farmers for Climate Action Group released a report this morning, or if you're in the US, tomorrow morning, entitled Fork in the Road, Impacts of Climate Change on Our Food Supply. And one line from that report says that Australia has robust logistic chains as far as food is concerned, but food supply is at risk if two or more catastrophic events were to be combined in the future. And climate change is having an impact not just in those countries which you might think of as most vulnerable to issues such as food supply and rising food prices, particularly when combined with war between Russia and Ukraine and other issues like that, but potentially even in countries like Australia. What's the situation as far as the US is concerned in farming and climate change?
Well, this year it hasn't been too bad. Last year, we had a lot of fires in the West. And that has been, that was terrible. So it wasn't just the fires, but it affects the quality of life and affects the crops. One of the things that we've seen persistent weather problems, one of the areas that we've had persistent weather problems in the U.S. is in the Western U.S. And that is an area where there's a lot of agriculture, and we have seen in various, like for instance, in California, they not only don't get rain in the summer, they don't get snow in the winter. And that snowpack is really important for a lot of their crops. And so we have that, and we have, let's see, right now we're, unfortunately, I don't know if we can show the map I brought along, but the U.S. Department of Agriculture puts together a map called the drought monitor, and
it's up on the screen at the moment.
Huh? Oh, you can see it? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Great, because it's not showing up on my end, but that's fine. What this drought monitor shows is that in the let me just open it on my end so I can see it real quickly. What it shows is that a big chunk of the United States is now in a drought, and now I'll get that up.
It looks very much like the areas of severe, extreme, and exceptional drought.
Yeah.
Virtually half the country.
Yeah. And current conditions there. Sorry about that. I don't know why it's not showing up on my map, but I mean on my screen. But So what the drought monitor shows is comparison with normal conditions. So it's not just that, maybe it's hot and dry. This is compared to the historical trend. And what you see is that half of the United States is in a state of severe drought or worse, and or almost half of that. But you also see that there's a lot of, the entire western half of the United States is in drought. And this has been going on for really quite a long time. And unfortunately, this has really caused permanent impacts to the U.S. Agriculture. And so, for instance, Shane, if you can show the next slide.
Yeah, we can see the Haystocks.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. The next slide, what that shows is Haystocks. And what the relevance of that is that, well, for one thing, a lot of that hay is grown in those areas where there's drought. And that, these are the plains areas. I mean, a lot of this is the plains areas of the United States. And so this has been big cattle ranching, range area. And so what this means is that when, so not only are the cattle having problems feeding just on the range, we also aren't even growing as much hay as we normally would. And so, and so, and you can see that really this started getting pretty bad in the 2010s, early 2010s. And it's just been persistent.
Can you tell us what the bottom axis is? Is that months or years down the bottom?
That is years.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So there was a very dry year back about 10 years, 11 years ago. And then it went back to normal, or trending back to normal, and then just dry.
Right. Yeah. There was a really bad drought in 2014 and 2012, 2013, 2014, around in there. And so the Haystocks really got hit in 2011. And I'll show you some other graphs that actually also show this. So, but what happened was, as a result of this, we actually saw a lot of animal production moving out of areas that traditionally had, been cattle area, and kind of moving to other areas of the country. the cattle industry is kind of a strain. It's very complicated industry because cattle, they take 4 years, from time you breed a cow to by the time they're ready to sell. And so what happens is you have a year-long period of gestation, and then the cow the cow gives birth. The calf is with its mother for about a year or so, and then after that it increases. It goes into what we call the feeder stage. I'm sorry, the stocker stage, and that's when they'd be eating a lot of the hay and a lot of the range and stuff. And then towards the end of its life, in the U.S. anyway, with the way we produce it, it goes to a feed yard, and that's when it's going to be fed the grains, gets fattened up, then it goes to market. Now, I think in Australia, a lot more of your cattle is free range. It's grass. Yeah. And so, but what's unusual about the U.S. with this system is that in certain areas of the country, they'll tend to specialize in one aspect of that chain of production. So, like in the Southeast, you see a lot of cow-calf operations. And so that's the cows and the mother and the baby calf. Then it'll move. They'll move into like maybe the Midwest, the Western regions.
So they transport them on trucks, just like.
I'm sorry.
Do they transport them on trucks? Hundreds of trucks traveling across. Yeah. Strange way to put, but there you go. I guess.
So what's been the impact? What's been the impact of this prolonged dry period or sequence of dry years on all this? I mean, in Australia, we've had droughts in the last decade where it's been a terrible struggle for farmers to keep feeding livestock, and farmers have had to move out of running cattle.
Yeah, we've had that. In Texas, there was a pretty good size packing plant that I think it was Cargill. They closed it down. It pretty much wiped out the town because most of the people were somehow involved with the cattle industry. And that directly came about because of the cattle crisis, because what was happening is it was really dry during that period of time, and they couldn't afford to feed the cattle. And so what happens is if they're too immature to go into slaughter, into feeding, they'll send them to be fed somewhere else. And so what happened was, all the cattle just were moved someplace else. These feedlots and ranches closed down, and the packing plant closed down. So
I mean, I guess in the bigger picture, we're all going to have to get used to eating less meat. Some of us are already sort of getting some comments that people are trying to buy grass-fed more than the feedlot cattle, which is great. And we each do what we can if that's something that we're passionate about, trying to protect the climate by changes that we make through our lifestyles. But really, individuals can only do so much. I keep coming back to that. It's about the state needing to step in to make decisions that are in the best interests of our future. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what's going to happen to these types of industries in the future, and whether it might come into something more like a just transition with people who are into this, working in this high intensity farming industry. Something's got to give at some point.
Yeah. Well, I think for one thing, a huge part of the United States, is involved in ranching. Agriculture is a big part of our economy. And and then when you consider the processing, everything, it's like, 1/7 of the economy. And so that's a huge thing. And in a lot of areas we have, a lot of remote areas that that's all the people have known for generations.
Both our countries are similar in that way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Yeah,
Both
you can say that
countries
about
are similar
Australia
in that way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm sure. And so, and for a lot of these people, this is their heritage. And so I don't see that meat, that like beef production is going to go away. I do think that there's like cultured meat, meat alternatives, and actually some meat that can be produced in the lab, sort of.
But that's
lab.
a long way from replacing,
Yeah.
So
I
thousands
think
and thousands of tons of meat that's eaten every day. Like I read online that the average American eats 120 kilograms of meat per year. Like that's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to fact check that. And Australia is about 80 kilograms.
But it's not just about meat production, is it, with climate change too? Because in Australia, we produce a lot of things we shouldn't produce here, like rice, for example, which have increasingly a problem with the drought and with water being diverted from. Since we're in Gabby and I are in South Australia, our big river is called the Murray River, which has been in crisis for many years now because of the demands of irrigation. Some of this potentially people say could be dealt with by moving some agricultural practices further north in the country where there is more rain. But the trouble is, further north in the country, there are irreplaceable ecological resources which would be destroyed as a result of moving the farming further north. So you potentially solve one problem but create something worse.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where, again, as Gabby said, I think the government can step in. USDA is actually has been doing some things. We actually just announced a $1 billion climate change initiative to fund research projects. And, this would include, farmers, and, so, and the funding levels vary from quite small to, $500,000 or something.
Well, that's really
and so the point of this is to develop ideas to try to, become more climate aware and more productive with new techniques that are more environmentally friendly. And I actually send along some links, which I believe Shane's going to put in the description, that actually we have give some information about various things that USDA is doing, also some stuff from the EPA. But yeah, I mean, it's going to take a certain amount of we're going to need new technology and new techniques to deal with this. But of course, they're not going to solve it alone.
No, but I guess it's a variety of different approaches. But it sounds like you're talking there about a move towards a more regenerative approach to farming with lower till methods and the avoidance of waste and keeping more carbon in the soil, those kind of issues.
Right.
I thought I might fling in something I've been reading about recently at this point in time, which is that our ability to feed, where are we, nearly 8 billion people on the world now, relates very much to, since you were talking about research and technology, to research and technology from about 100 years ago, when Fritz Haber developed the Haber-Bosch process for capturing nitrogen from the air.
Oh yeah.
And when we started using on an industrial scale, an intensive farming, both nitrogen and phosphorus added to the soil which has transformed us from, 100 years ago, people thought that intensive farming might one day allow the planet to carry 4 billion people. And we're now feeding 8 billion people. But we're doing it using those fertilizers, which 85% at the moment of what is put on the land is wasted, goes into our waterways and eventually in the sea, and without going into the details of it, basically creates dead zones, has catastrophic consequences, 85%. And we can't do it for him. 85%. The added in fertilizers that we add to the land, so the Farmers for Climate Action report says anyway, 85% is runoff as far as nitrogen and phosphorus is concerned. What that then does is it leads to the development of algal blooms in waterways, which suck the oxygen out of the water and create dead zones in rivers and lakes and in the sea as well. And so it's not just about climate change, it's about ecological sustainability generally. And I think we need a big effort, which has to be funded by our big monetary sovereign federal governments, and perhaps isn't at the moment, to consider how are we going to feed 8 to 10 billion people in a way which doesn't destroy our environment.
Yeah, no, that's completely correct. That's completely correct. One thing in mentioning about people's, staying on the land, a lot of the people who, a lot of the beef cattle ranchers, they kind of feel like they are stewards of the land, and there are a lot of people who really have always taken environmental stuff into account. And so I think we need to, be aware that there's a lot of people who have a lot of experience and, they just need maybe some better incentives. Another thing, though, of interest, at least in the U.S., this is the case, is that a lot of the farmers now are, beyond, we have a real age problem in that, a lot of farmers are aging out or getting very close to retirement. And there's nobody to fill in for them because, farm prices have gotten so high, so high. And then it's not just, it's land, it's the, very sophisticated technology, it's the expertise. It takes a huge amount of information, to grow crops and stuff. And so it's monumentally expensive to just try to get into farming. But,
it's very much about the attitudes to climate change that US farmers have. Is there growing acceptance of the science, or is there a lot of people who still think that there's nothing that human beings have no impact on the climate?
Well, my experience is there's probably, I shouldn't say experience, but what I have been seeing in looking at the trade press is it seems like there's less denying it. And it seems like there's more just kind of accepting. And certainly in the case of like the leadership, they know, because it's making a difference.
Farmers have the lived experience. They can see it around them.
Well,
they're more directly affected by it than most people are.
But there's still attitudes in Australia that, we've always had droughts and floods and this is no worse than it's been before. I think those are changing, but it's definitely still a problem. And I think another big problem is that our media have been incredibly slow to make the link explicit between extreme weather and climate change. And they still, there's still this attitude, like when a disaster happens, like a flood or a fire, that, oh no, this is not the time to talk about climate action because people are still hurting and people need our support, and we should just ignore that problem and put it out of our minds until there is a time when we have the headspace to talk about it. That time is pretty much gone.
Yeah. I think even nowadays, our media has been like that. Now they actually are starting to acknowledge that things are happening because of climate change. They're doing, they're not telling, showing stories about, what people are doing about it, or they're not teaching people what options might be. They don't talk about policy, but they actually do. They actually are using the words climate change.
Okay. Well, that is a step in the right direction. 25 years too late, but we'll take it.
Exactly.
Well, there's a limit to what farmers can do. We can adjust, and farmers can move and be encouraged to move by governments towards more regenerative farming, including for cattle, because not everybody is going to become a vegetarian. But in the end, there is a limit to what we can do without tackling the overarching problem, which is climate change. Generally, you can only adjust to a certain degree. So it comes back to, if we want 1.5 degrees warming, then we should be cutting emissions at 7 to 10% per annum. And actually this year, there'll be a record level of emissions. They're not falling at all. They're still rising. Wow. And even if we want to keep it below 2 degrees, we need to be cutting emissions at 5% per annum. And current policies, people who are experts say, are consistent with 3 degrees of global warming, and the climate extremes we are going to have, if that takes place, I think will be beyond the ability of farmers in large parts of the world, including probably much of the US, to adjust. It'll just be taken out of our control. I think farming and climate change sits within, it's part of the big picture.
Exactly. Totally. Yeah. And I think, I think we have an opportunity here, because we do have a lot of the older people who've been resistant to changing that, are getting out, and, a lot of them want to get out, but they need somebody, all their wealth is in their farm. And so, they need somebody to come in and take that on. And certainly we really could use some programs that can help young people get into farming, help them teach them to farm, help them learn more ecologically safe ways.
Which kind of circles down to another thing that we understand as the prescriptive side of modern monetary theory, right? So, there is all this work that needs to be done, and we have a resource of people who don't have enough work, and we have the capacity with our governments could actually support people to be working in this sort of more hands-on, because the type of farming we're talking about that we need to start doing more of is the labor-intensive side, right? We don't want to have a bunch of sort of like an automation future where machines are driving the tractors and running the farms, although there's plenty of movement in that direction as well. But the more sustainable agriculture requires more human input, right?
Yeah. And even not necessarily even just what we might normally think of is, hoeing, the more physical, but, gathering information about what's going on in the farm to determine, when do we need to take pest control measures? When do we need, and we have the ability now to narrow it down to, small patches.
Yeah, more localized, more value add.
Yeah, right.
More stewardship, as Sherry was saying before, and less added artificial fertilizer. I mean, we're not saying no, we can't feed people without using these things at all.
Right.
But we have to avoid putting too much on, or putting it on in the wrong places, and seeing all that runoff.
Yeah.
It's
very wasteful. And one thing, Gabby, to your point about the media, I think there's another group that could do a little more to educate people about environment and the costs of climate change, and that's economists. Because one thing is being in the government, we deal with regulations, and when there's a large bill, that gets passed, becomes a law, and we write rules about it, to implement those rules, we have to do benefit cost analyses. And unfortunately, the benefits tend to be things that are hard to quantify. The costs are very quantifiable. And so what happens is that there's a tendency for many of the economists and, in different parts of the government to really focus in on those costs, and also not be more open to, looking at, how we can deal with costs that we can't, benefits that we can't quantify.
Actually, you've just given me a very good opportunity to mention that in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have on this show Steve Keane, who is one of the best writers on the economics of climate change these days. I mean, in the past, he used to write a lot about financial instability, but recently he's been writing about the catastrophically bad neoclassical economics of climate change, which has come out of the work of the Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus and some of his colleagues, which has done just what Sherry was talking about, really, on a macro rather than a micro level. It's overestimated the costs of dealing with carbon emissions and climate change, and severely underestimated the benefits.
Right. Yeah.
Of doing
and
so.
One of the things that actually really irritates me about how this is done is that there seems to, economists tend to forget that when even if you just look back at Econ 101, when you're talking about externalities, even if you have something as simple as a tax to reduce the amount of pollution, that cost is supposed to be there. And so, there's this tendency to be very defensive about what these costs are, but the costs are actually something we need to acknowledge, because we're imposing those costs. When you if you over fertilize land that goes down and the runoff goes down the Mississippi, you're affecting a fishery or a shrimpery or something, So, I mean, there are other people who get affected by this stuff. And they're a lot harder to identify. But we need to acknowledge those costs. We need to stop being so defensive and kind of ashamed, if costs are high. Well, it's certainly the case that, maybe they're supposed to be that high.
There's so much that's similar between our two countries. Like everything that you've said about the US applies in Australia as well. I think, we both got a lot of taste and, an advanced sort of farming economy and growing things and farming things in the wrong areas and all the problems that you've described with us as well. Yeah, as a livestock economist, I've seen a lot of the stuff that in the last decade or so that Australia's dealt with respect to livestock production, because you've had drought, and then other times there've been massive floods,
and then just carried all kinds of animals away. And so there's just
know,
been
it's
a
awful.
huge environmental impact.
Stephen, you said.
No. Oh, I was just going to be agreeing with Sherry, really, and say what we've heard from Sherry for the last half an hour or so is, as much as anything else, a call to action for governments. And it's a place where there is an overlap between an ecological perspective, which is vitally important, and action by monetary sovereign governments. So there's an overlap with MMT there. And I 100% agree with what Sherry was saying about externalities. It's even perhaps gone beyond that. It's not just the costs that we impose on other people who are difficult to identify at the moment. It's that I think we are close to the point where it's about the risk of the collapse of our civilization in a few years' time if we don't get this right.
I totally agree. Totally agree. Another thing that I do in my job is we purchase food for a lot of the food assistance programs in the U.S. And so even though we don't deal with marine fisheries or anything, it has affected our ability to purchase those commodities, because one of the things that happens with the oceans is as the water temperature increases, fish that normally would be in, say, warmer waters start moving further north. Fish that normally would be in cold waters, they start moving, or they're hard to find. Even highly migratory species like tuna are affected. And so it's mind-boggling when you really have to think about all these things.
Yeah.
It is indeed. It is indeed. But there's still time.
Every fraction of a degree is worth fighting for.
It's not everything or nothing. We're already suffering from the consequences of climate change, and people in lower income countries suffer much more than we do. But we can limit climate change. It's a terrible tragedy that the climate change part of the Build Back Better package in the US seems to have been held up. And I hope that will change. And I hope that governments in countries like Australia and the US and China and the other big emitters get onto carbon emissions generally, but also part of that is sustainable farming and supporting farmers so that they can move towards sustainable farming. It's not about punishing anyone. We all have to work on this together, and the work of people like Sherry is so important. So I think we have to wind it up there, really. But I'd like to thank Sherry again for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's marvelous. I hope we'll see you again, because we only get to chat for a short time on these shows. Next week, we're going to be talking, we hope, with Con Michalakis, who is, so to be slightly different. He's a leading investment officer in Australia, who's also worked on Wall Street. He's the chief investment officer of Statewide Super, which is the largest financial institution in South Australia, and also the chairman of Modern Money Lab that Gabby is the CEO from. So we'll be asking a Wall Street guy why modern monetary theory is important to him, why he thinks it's important next week. And then, as we were saying, since we mentioned it before, I mentioned it again, we'll talk a little bit about the economics of climate change, and also why he's standing for the Senate in Australia, to Professor Steve Keane in 2 weeks' time. We're very much looking forward to that, and we'd love to have Sherry back on again before too long as well. And other than that, I think we just have to mention that Joe Firestone's excellent show is on at 9 o'clock EST. And thank everybody for watching.
Thanks. See you next time.
Thank you for having me. You guys did a good job.
Good on you.